Chapter 5. The long conversation of Zamacona and his visitors took place in the green-blue twilight of the grove just outside the temple door. Some of the men reclined on the weeds and moss beside the half-vanished walk, while others, including the Spaniard and the chief spokesman of the South Party, sat on the occasional low monolithic pillars that lined the temple approach. Almost a whole terrestrial day must have been consumed in the colloquy, for Zamacona felt the need of food several times, and ate from his well-stocked pack, while some of the South Party went back for provisions to the roadway where they had left the animals on which they had ridden. At length the prime leader of the party brought the discourse to a close and indicated that the time had come to proceed to the city. There were, he affirmed, several extra beasts in the cavalcade, upon one of which Zamacona could ride. The prospect of mounting one of those ominous hybrid entities whose fabled nourishment was so alarming and a single sight of which had set charging buffalo into such a frenzy of flight was by no means reassuring to the traveller. There was, moreover, another point about the things which disturbed him greatly. The apparently preternatural intelligence with which some members of the previous day's roving pack had reported his presence to the men of Tsath and brought out the present expedition. But Zamacona was not a coward, hence followed the men boldly down the weed-grown walk toward the road where the things were stationed. And yet he could not refrain from crying out in terror at what he saw when he passed through the great vine-draped pylons and emerged upon the ancient road. He did not wonder that the curious Wichita had fled in panic and had to close his eyes a moment to retain his sanity. It is unfortunate that some sense of pious reticence prevented him from describing fully in his manuscript the nameless sight he saw. As it is, he merely hinted at the shocking morbidity of these great floundering white things with black fur on their backs, a rudimentary horn in the center of their foreheads, and an unmistakable trace of human or anthropoid blood in their flat-nosed, bulging-lipped faces. They were, he declared, later in his manuscript, the most terrible objective entities he ever saw in his life, either in Canyan or in the outer world. And the specific quality of their supreme terror was something apart from any easily recognizable or describable feature. The main trouble was that they were not wholly products of nature. The party observed Zamacona's fright and hastened to reassure him as much as possible. The beasts, or Gyayothan, they explained, surely were curious things, but were really very harmless. The flesh they ate was not that of intelligent people of the master race, but merely that of a special slave class which had, for the most part, ceased to be thoroughly human, and which indeed was the principal meat stock of Canyan. They, or their principal ancestral element, had first been found in a wild state amidst the cyclopean ruins of the deserted, red-litten world of Yoth, which lay below the blue-litten world of Canyan. That part of them was human, seemed quite clear, but men of science could never decide whether they were actually the descendants of the bygone entities who had lived and reigned in the strange ruins. The chief ground for such a supposition was the well-known fact that the vanished inhabitants of Yoth had been quadrupedal. This much was known from the very few manuscripts and carvings found in the vaults of Zin, beneath the largest ruined city of Yoth. But it was also known from these manuscripts that the beings of Yoth had possessed the art of synthetically creating life and had made and destroyed several efficiently designed races of industrial and transportational animals in the course of their history, to say nothing of concocting all manner of fantastic living shapes for the sake of amusement and new sensations during the long period of decadence. The beings of Yoth had undoubtedly been reptilian in affiliations, and most physiologists of Sath agreed that the present beasts had been very much inclined toward reptilianism before they had been crossed with the mammal slave class of Kunyan. It argues well for the intrepid fire of those Renaissance Spaniards who conquered half the unknown world that Panfilo de Zamacona y Núñez actually mounted one of the morbid beasts of Sath and fell into place beside the leader of the cavalcade, the man named Gulthain, who had been most active in the previous exchange of information. It was a repulsive business, but after all the seat was very easy, and the gait of the clumsy Gyayoth surprisingly even and regular. No saddle was necessary, and the animal appeared to require no guidance whatever. The procession moved forward at a brisk gait, stopping only at certain abandoned cities and temples about which Zamacona was curious, and which Gulthain was obligingly ready to display and explain. The largest of these towns, Bigra, was a marvel of finely wrought gold, and Zamacona studied the curiously ornate architecture with avid interest. Buildings tended toward height and slenderness, with roofs bursting into a multitude of pinnacles. The streets were narrow, curving, and occasionally picturesquely hilly, but Gulthain said that the later cities of Kunyan were far more spacious and regular in design. All these old cities of the plain showed traces of leveled walls, reminders of the archaic days when they had been successively conquered by the now dispersed armies of Sath. There was one object along the route which Gulthain exhibited on his own initiative, even though it involved a detour of about a mile along a vine-tangled side path. This was a squat, plain temple of black basalt blocks without a single carving, and containing only a vacant onyx pedestal. The remarkable thing about it was its story, for it was a link with a fabled elder world compared to which even cryptic Yoth was a thing of yesterday. It had been built in imitation of certain temples depicted in the vaults of Zin to house a very terrible black toad idol found in the red-litten world and called Tsathogwa in the Yothic manuscripts. It had been a potent and widely worshipped god, and after its adoption by the people of Kunyan, had lent its name to the city which was later to become dominant in that region. Yothic legend said that it had come from a mysterious inner realm beneath the red-litten world, a black realm of peculiar sensed beings which had no light at all, but which had had great civilizations and mighty gods before ever the reptilian quadrupeds of Yoth had come into being. Many images of Tsathogwa existed in Yoth, all of which were alleged to have come from the black inner realm, and which were supposed by Yothic archaeologists to represent the eon-extinct race of that realm. The black realm called Nakai in the Yothic manuscripts had been explored as thoroughly as possible by these archaeologists, and singular stone troughs or burrows had excited infinite speculation. When the men of Kunyan discovered the red-litten world and deciphered its strange manuscripts, they took over the Tsathogwa cult and brought all the frightful toad images up to the land of blue light, housing them in shrines of Yoth-quarried basalt like the one Zamacona now saw. The cult flourished until it almost rivaled the ancient cults of Yig and Cthulhu, and one branch of the race even took it to the outer world, where the smallest of the images eventually found a shrine at Alathoe in the land of Lomar near the Earth's North Pole. It was rumored that this outer world cult survived even after the great ice sheet and the hairy Nofkes destroyed Lomar, but of such matters not much was definitely known in Kunyan. In that world of blue light, the cult came to an abrupt end, even though the name of Sath was suffered to remain. What ended the cult was the partial exploration of the black realm of Nakai beneath the red-litten world of Yoth. According to the Yothic manuscripts, there was no surviving life in Nakai, but something must have happened in the eons between the days of Yoth and the coming of men to the earth, something perhaps not unconnected with the end of Yoth. Probably it had been an earthquake, opening up lower chambers of the lightless world which had been closed against the Yothic archaeologists, or perhaps some more frightful juxtaposition of energy and electrons, wholly inconceivable to any sort of vertebrate minds, had taken place. At any rate, when the men of Kanyan went down into Nakai's black abyss with their great atom-power searchlights, they found living things that oozed along stone channels and worshipped onyx and basalt images of Sathoga. But they were not toads like Sathoga himself. Far worse. They were amorphous lumps of viscous, black slime that took temporary shapes for various purposes. The explorers of Kanyan did not pause for detailed observations, and those who escaped alive sealed the passage leading from red-litten Yoth down into the gulfs of nether horror. Then all the images of Sathogwa in the land of Kanyan were dissolved into the ether by disintegrating rays, and the cult was abolished forever. Aeons later, when naive fears were outgrown and supplanted by scientific curiosity, the old legends of Sathogwa and Nakai were recalled, and a suitably armed and equipped exploring party went down to Yoth to find the closed gate of the Black Abyss and see what might still lie beneath. But they could not find the gate, nor could any man ever do so in all the ages that followed. Nowadays there were those who doubted that any abyss had ever existed, but the few scholars who could still decipher the Yothic manuscripts believed that the evidence for such a thing was adequate, even though the middle records of Kanyan, with accounts of the one frightful expedition into Nakai, were more open to question. Some of the later religious cults tried to suppress remembrance of Nakai's existence and attached severe penalties to its mention. But these had not begun to be taken seriously at the time of Zamakona's advent to Kanyan. As the cavalcade returned to the old highway and approached the low range of mountains, Zamakona saw that the river was very close on the left. Somewhat later, as the terrain rose, the stream entered a gorge and passed through the hills, while the road traversed the gap at a rather higher level close to the brink. It was about this time that light rainfall came. Zamakona noticed the occasional drops and drizzle and looked up at the coruscating blue air, but there was no diminution of the strange radiance. Gotha-in then told him that such condensations and precipitations of water vapor were not uncommon, and that they never dimmed the glare of the vault above. A kind of mist, indeed, always hung about the lowlands of Kanyan and compensated for the complete absence of true clouds. The slight rise of the mountain pass enabled Zamakona, by looking behind, to see the ancient and deserted plain in panorama as he had seen it from the other side. He seems to have appreciated its strange beauty and to have vaguely regretted leaving it, for he speaks of being urged by Glo-tha-in to drive his beast more rapidly. When he faced frontward again, he saw that the crest of the road was very near, the weed-grown way leading starkly up and ending against a blank void of blue light. The scene was undoubtedly highly impressive, a steep green mountain wall on the right, a deep river chasm on the left with another green mountain wall beyond it, and ahead the churning sea of bluish coruscations into which the upward path dissolved. Then came the crest itself, and with it the world of Tsath outspread in a stupendous forward vista. Zamakona caught his breath at the great sweep of peopled landscape, for it was a hive of settlement and activity beyond anything he had ever seen or dreamed of. The downward slope of the hill itself was relatively thinly strewn with small farms and occasional temples, but beyond it lay an enormous plain covered like a chessboard with planted trees, irrigated by narrow canals cut from the river and threaded by wide, geometrically precise roads of gold or basalt blocks. Great silver cables borne aloft on golden pillars linked the low, spreading buildings and clusters of buildings which rose here and there, and in some places one could see lines of partly ruinous pillars without cables. Moving objects showed the fields to be under tillage, and in some cases Zamacona saw that men were ploughing with the aid of the repulsive, half-human quadrupeds. But most impressive of all was the bewildering vision of clustered spires and pinnacles, which rose afar off across the plain and shimmered flower-like and spectral in the coruscating blue light. At first, Zamacona thought it was a mountain covered with houses and temples, like some of the picturesque hill cities of his own Spain, but a second glance showed him that it was not indeed such. It was a city of the plain, but fashioned of such heaven-reaching towers that its outline was truly that of a mountain. Above it hung a curious greyish haze, through which the blue light glistened and took added overtones of radiance from the million golden minarets. Glancing at Gothain, Zamacona knew that this was the monstrous, gigantic and omnipotent city of Sath. As the road turned downward toward the plain, Zamacona felt a kind of uneasiness and sense of evil. He did not like the beast he rode, or the world that could provide such a beast, and he did not like the atmosphere that brooded over the distant city of Sath. When the cavalcade began to pass occasional farms, the Spaniard noticed the forms that worked in the fields, and did not like their motions and proportions, or the mutilations he saw on most of them. Moreover, he did not like the way that some of these forms were herded in corrals, or the way they grazed on the heavy verdure. Gothain indicated that these beings were members of the slave class, and that their acts were controlled by the master of the farm, who gave them hypnotic impressions in the morning of all they were to do during the day. As semi-conscious machines, their industrial efficiency was nearly perfect. Those in the corrals were inferior specimens, classified merely as livestock. Upon reaching the plain, Zamacona saw the larger farms and noted the almost human work performed by the repulsive horned Gyayothan. He likewise observed the more man-like shapes that toiled along the furrows, and felt a curious fright and disgust towards certain of them whose motions were more mechanical than those of the rest. These, Gothain explained, were what men called the Yimbi, organisms which had died, but which had been mechanically reanimated for industrial purposes by means of atomic energy and thought power. The slave class did not share the immortality of the freemen of Sath, so that with time the number of Yimbi had become very large. They were dog-like and faithful, but not so readily amenable to thought commands as were living slaves. Those which most repelled Zamacona were those whose mutilations were greatest, for some were wholly headless, while others had suffered singular and seemingly capricious subtractions, distortions, transpositions, and graftings in various places. The Spaniard could not account for this condition, but Gothain made it clear that these were slaves who had been used for the amusement of the people in some of the vast arenas. For the men of Sath were connoisseurs of delicate sensation, and required a constant supply of fresh and novel stimuli for their jaded impulses. Zamacona, though by no means squeamish, was not favourably impressed by what he saw and heard. Approached more closely, the vast metropolis became dimly horrible in its monstrous extent and inhuman height. Gothain explained that the upper parts of the great towers were no longer used, and that many had been taken down to avoid the bother of maintenance. The plain around the original urban area was covered with newer and smaller dwellings, which in many cases were preferred to the ancient towers. From the whole mass of gold and stone a monotonous roar of activity droned outward over the plain, while cavalcades and streams of wagons were constantly entering and leaving over the great gold or stone-paved roads. Several times, Gulthain paused to show Zamakona some particular object of interest, especially the temples of Yig, Cthulhu, Nug, Yeb, and the not-to-be-named one which lined the road at infrequent intervals, each in its embowering grove according to the custom of Kanyan. These temples, unlike those of the deserted plain beyond the mountains, were still in active use, large parties of mounted worshippers coming and going in constant streams. Gul-Tha-In took Zamakona into each of them, and the Spaniard watched the subtle orgiastic rites with fascination and repulsion. The ceremonies of Nug and Yeb sickened him especially, so much indeed that he refrained from describing them in his manuscript. One squat black temple of Sathoga was encountered, but it had been turned into a shrine of Shub-Niggurath, the all-mother and wife of the not-to-be-named one. This deity was a kind of sophisticated Astarte, and her worship struck the pious Catholic as supremely obnoxious. What he liked least of all were the emotional sounds emitted by the celebrants, jarring sounds in a race that had ceased to use vocal speech for ordinary purposes. Close to the compact outskirts of Tsath, and well within the shadow of its terrifying towers, Gulthain pointed out a monstrous circular building before which enormous crowds were lined up. This, he indicated, was one of the many amphitheatres where curious sports and sensations were provided for the weary people of Kanyan. He was about to pause and usher Zamakona inside the vast curved facade, when the Spaniard, recalling the mutilated forms he had seen in the fields, violently demurred. This was the first of those friendly clashes of taste which were to convince the people of Tsath that their guest followed strange and narrow standards. Tsath itself was a network of strange and ancient streets, and despite a growing sense of horror and alienage, Zamakona was enthralled by its intimations of mystery and cosmic wonder. The dizzy giganticism of its overawing towers, the monstrous surge of teeming life through its ornate avenues, the curious carvings on its doorways and windows, the odd vistas glimpsed from balustraded plazas and tiers of Titan terraces, and the enveloping grey haze which seemed to press down on the gorge-like streets in low-ceiling fashion, all combined to produce such a sense of adventurous expectancy as he had never known before. He was taken at once to a council of executives which held forth in a gold and copper palace behind a gardened and fountained park, and was for some time subjected to close, friendly questioning in a vaulted hall frescoed with vertiginous arabesques. Much was expected of him, he could see, in the way of historical information about the outside earth, but in return all the mysteries of Kanyan would be unveiled to him. The one great drawback was the inexorable ruling that he might never return to the world of sun and stars and Spain which was his. A daily program was laid down for the visitor, with time apportioned judiciously among several kinds of activities. There were to be conversations with persons of learning in various places, and lessons in many branches of Tsathic law. Liberal periods of research were allowed for, and all the libraries of Kanyan, both secular and sacred, were to be thrown open to him as soon as he might master the written languages. Rites and spectacles were to be attended, except when he might especially object, and much time would be left for the enlightened pleasure-seeking and emotional titillation which formed the goal and nucleus of daily life. A house in the suburbs or an apartment in the city would be assigned him, and he would be initiated into one of the large affection groups, including many noble women of the most extreme and art-enhanced beauty, which in latter-day Kanyan took the place of family units. Several horned Gyayothan would be provided for his transportation and errand running, and 10 living slaves of intact body would serve to conduct his establishment and protect him from thieves and sadists and religious orgiasts on the public highways. There were many mechanical devices which he must learn to use, but Gl-Tha-In would instruct him immediately regarding the principal ones. Upon his choosing an apartment in preference to a suburban villa, Zamacona was dismissed by the executives with great courtesy and ceremony, and was led through several gorgeous streets to a cliff-like carven structure of some 70 or 80 floors. Preparations for his arrival had already been instituted, and in a spacious ground-floor suite of vaulted rooms, slaves were busy adjusting hangings and furniture. There were lacquered and inlaid tabourets, velvet and silk reclining corners and squatting cushions, and infinite rows of teakwood and ebony pigeonholes with metal cylinders containing some of the manuscripts he was soon to read, standard classics which all urban apartments possessed. Desks with great stacks of membrane paper and pots of the prevailing green pigment were in every room, each with graded sets of pigment brushes and other odd bits of stationery. Mechanical writing devices stood on ornate golden tripods, while over all was shed a brilliant blue light from energy globes set in the ceiling. There were windows, but at this shadowy ground level they were of scant, illuminating value. In some of the rooms were elaborate baths, while the kitchen was a maze of technical contrivances. Supplies were brought, Zamacona was told, through the network of underground passages which lay beneath Tsath, and which had once accommodated curious mechanical transports. There was a stable on that underground level for the beasts, and Zamacona would presently be shown how to find the nearest runway to the street. Before his inspection was finished, the permanent staff of slaves arrived and were introduced, and shortly afterward there came some half-dozen free men and noblewomen of his future affection group, who were to be his companions for several days, contributing what they could to his instruction and amusement. Upon their departure, another party would take their place, and so onward in rotation through a group of about 50 members.